I grew up in this really weird era with regard to Star Wars. The original trilogy started in 1977 and wrapped up 2 years before I was born. By the time I was a half self-aware kid, the original film was 14 years old, a little further back now than we are from the first Lord of the Rings film. So I can't say I have any real sense of ownership over Star Wars, not in the way that the group of kids that saw it in the 70s and 80s did. It wasn't my thing. It was the thing that belonged to people 5, 10, even 15 years older than me. Instead, to me, Star Wars was largely an inherited, and I dare even say a used, pre-owned thing. A friend's college-aged brother saw it as a kid and fell in love with it, so my friend and I did too by proxy. Hand-me-down stormtrooper action figures and 10-plus years of cultural adulation were gifted to us. I never really got to decide if I liked Star Wars because by the time I was on the scene, Star Wars had already been enshrined as simply something that geeky kids liked. I didn't have any say in the matter, really. I never even saw the films in theaters. Just molested special editions and TV versions without the original aspect ratio and cut for time. Like the toys we played with, the films we saw were themselves hand-me-down versions. And there wasn't really any new material for me to call my own in the 90s. At least not like the early and mid-80s where we had 2 new films and an Ewok cartoon and a Droids cartoon and a holiday special. Okay, aside from the movies, most of those were cheesy and awful, but at least it was something. And the 90s were certainly not like today, where a trilogy of films recently wrapped up, there have been 2 separate Clone Wars animated series that have both been really highly regarded, a Clone Wars film was released, crossovers were made with Family Guy and Robot Chicken, and 3 more movies are in pre-production. If you spent your childhood in the late 80s and most of the 90s, though, you fell in between the cracks of Star Wars releases. Too young to lay claim to the original trilogy, and too old to enjoy the new one with fresh eyes. There were novels, I guess, but by the time I could read, I was focused more on Crichton and Gibson, and embarrassingly enough, a whole host of my mom's Grisham, King, and Kuntz novels. Regardless, I wasn't really interested in picking up canonized fan fiction. Really, there was only ever one set of Star Wars properties I felt comfortable calling my own: the video games. My Star Wars wasn't one of celluloid, but one of pixels. It wasn't one of plot points, but one of systems. It wasn't an adventure, but a possibility space of themes and ideas. My Star Wars was an action shooter, a racer, an adventure game, a platformer, a role-playing game, a real-time strategy game, and a space combat game. My Star Wars contained multitudes, and was all the richer for it. My friend's brother may have gotten to claim ownership to the thrills of watching Luke blow up the Death Star on the big screen, but kids my age got to lay claim to the experience of navigating the trench run themselves. My point isn't that Star Wars works better as a video game, but rather that my childhood was spent exploring Star Wars as a series of systems and rules rather than as a story. And game developers were quick to toy with how the Star Wars universe worked as a system. Taking out AT-ATs on Hoth with a snowspeeder's grapple hook, dogfighting in deep space, the Death Star's trench run, and lightsaber duels all became fast favorites with developers and players alike as soon as technology allowed for them. They were game systems that held onto the series' operatic emotions and epic scale while still affording a degree of mechanical depth. But with each new mechanic discovered and each scene or idea systemized, the picture games painted of Star Wars world became more complete. I don't need to imagine what it's like to fight TIE fighters, or avoid stormtrooper fire, or resist the temptation of the dark side of the Force. I've done it. And done it, and done it, and done it. And now, over 35 years since the original film debuted, I think it's safe to say we've systemized most of the meaningful, recognizable elements of the series. We've hit peak Star Wars. I mean, how many games have had the infamous scrolling exposition? That's not to say that there aren't any systems left to explore, or that there are no stories left to be told, but the most immediate and recognizable systems distinct to the Star Wars universe have been pretty thoroughly explored at this point. What's left to experiment with? Moisture Farmer Tycoon? A flavor of the Incredible Machine where you help Ewoks build traps on Endor? A Star Wars twine game about an Imperial officer from Alderaan wrestling with his emotions about being on the Death Star when it blew up his home planet? Not that any of these are bad, they all sound kind of cool, actually, but how do they either help us understand the universe that inspired them, or even just justify the use of that expensive Disney license? How much better could a farm simulator, Home Alone trap builder, or space opera twine game be without the burden of the increasingly worn Star Wars license? How far removed from the core Star Wars experience and story are we willing to go just to hold on to this franchise instead of letting these games be themselves? Not that those questions necessarily matter anymore. I think games like Force Unleashed and the cancelled 1313 and even LEGO Star Wars show this desire to move beyond even trying to systemize Star Wars. The license is no longer something that inspires games, it's something that inspires game settings. The vaguely Star Wars RPG, the vaguely Star Wars MMO, the vaguely Star Wars third-person action game, the vaguely Star Wars family game. And let's not forget that this happened. This universe that used to be fertile ground for countless new games with new mechanics is now just a wrapper to package stock genre titles in. The earliest Star Wars games were obviously breaking new ground. Jedi Arena was pretty much a new game from the ground up, and the 1983 Star Wars arcade game established how the Trench Run would be turned into a game for the next 30 years. But even later genre titles made an effort to integrate newly minted Star Wars mechanics. Yeah, Dark Forces was a first-person shooter, but it was a shooter that experimented with light and dark Jedi powers, and how those crazy Star Wars blasters would actually work before any of those things had become commonplace. Yeah, Empire at War is a real-time strategy game, but it tried to be an RTS that incorporated ideas core to the Star Wars universe. Smugglers, droids, and bounty hunters were all units that had unique capabilities, and the game focused on balancing ground assaults with aerial combat much like the third film showed. The Rebels had to steal technology while the Empire had to actually research it, which set up a really interesting power dynamic between the two. I'd actually recommend this game if you really wanted to see some neat ways of systemizing a film. Yeah, Battlefront was basically Battlefield, but that was sort of the point. It explored the pulpy World War II roots of Star Wars at the tail end of the World War II game craze, complete with grizzled soldiers speaking over old-timey footage and dogfighting mechanics that kept everyone aligned with a singular up even though you were in space. It felt more like Red Baron than Free Space, and that was intentional.
Emerging battle-hardened and ready for whatever the war would throw at us.
All of these games took systems and ideas that the films hinted at and turned them into something tangible, something you could test the limits of. Whether it was pod racing or taking part in Jedi training, Star Wars games of times past tried to explore Star Wars through systems. In contrast, look at, say, The Force Unleashed. It's a fine game, don't get me wrong. It's pretty and it makes good use of lots of really neat tech. But its mechanics frame the game as basically God of War with lightsabers. It's more interested in making the player feel incredibly powerful than in exploring how Star Wars works or what Star Wars means. I mean, it's a game where Darth Vader can do this. It's well-intentioned and well-designed, but it doesn't seem to be interested in systemizing the universe in the way the previous games did. And you can see this with a lot of the more recent Star Wars games. Knights of the Old Republic may have laid the foundation for games like Mass Effect, but in doing so it underscored how little the Star Wars license was core to its gameplay and systems. KOTOR was a bridge between Neverwinter Nights and the modern BioWare RPGs that just happened to be set in the Star Wars universe. Similarly, the Old Republic is a pretty stock post-World of Warcraft MMO. Its big selling point, a fully voice-acted story, could have been applied to just about any license, really.
You face your trials, you serve me, and I will make you the most powerful acolyte here.
Sounds like a plan.
The trials themselves are difficult enough, but they are hardly the greatest threat you face.
Compare that to Galaxies, which may have struggled to come up with a Jedi system players could love, but at least tried some interesting things by limiting the Jedi population on servers. LEGO Star Wars was cute and fun and had a million addictive collectibles to catch, but as all of the other licensed LEGO games have shown, there was nothing quintessentially Star Wars about it. Heck, by all accounts, 1313 was going to be a grimdark Star Wars-coded version of Uncharted or Tomb Raider. I want to emphasize that these aren't, or in 1313's case might not have been, bad games, but they're games that are more concerned with taking Star Wars and applying it as a wrapper for established game mechanics rather than as a basis for new game mechanics. I mean, I don't think I have to point out much more than Connect Star Wars for evidence of this. Whether you think we should be done making new Star Wars games or not, it's clear that the games industry is done making new games out of Star Wars. There was a small cottage industry, almost an entire subgenre of games, dedicated to examining parts of the Star Wars universe. Its vehicles, its technology, its rituals, its black and white moral compass, its influences, and its warfare were all poked and prodded via game systems. But at this point, the games industry has taken what's worked, or what's been most popular, like lightsaber duels and AT-AT harpooning, appropriated those mechanics into its established genres, and shunted the rest. So with all of this in mind, I struggle to really care about Disney's acquisition of LucasArts and now EA's exclusivity deal with Disney. We may very well see some amazing games and memorable stories come out of these deals, but it's going to be in the form of a Star Wars license applied to a stock BioWare RPG or a third-person shooter set in the Clone Wars. They won't necessarily be bad games, but they also won't be games that do much more than look like Star Wars on the surface. They'll have the opening exposition crawl, they'll have the Star Wars soundtrack, they'll make the references Star Wars fans want, and they'll play like any other game you've played in the past 5 years. But they'd play that way whether the series was licensed by LucasArts or by Disney. They'd play that way whether the publisher was EA, Activision, or 2K. These deals don't impact how Star Wars gets turned into games because we stopped turning Star Wars into games years ago. And not because developers are creatively bankrupt, and not even because it costs so much to experiment with new mechanics, but because we've tapped just about every uniquely Star Wars experience possible. What's left is either stuff that would be better suited to being its own standalone game, or stuff that reinvents the wheel for yet another trench run, second Death Star escape, or Hoth battle reenactment. And so in a certain sense, I think we need to let Star Wars go. The brother of my childhood friend had his Star Wars experience end in 1983 with the release of Return of the Jedi. After that, there may have been cartoons and holiday specials, but the core experience of the universe was over for him. They stopped making Star Wars movies. The date of when my Star Wars ended is more nebulous, but I can tell you this. It happened not when they stopped making Star Wars games, but when they stopped exploring Star Wars with games. I'll catch you next time.